Welcome. This training has been designed to just walk through the general eligibility factors for the migrant education program. These resources you can all find on our website, and they are broken down by modules, and we thought it might be helpful to just have a quick breakdown of the factors and you can kind of think through it. So I'm going to walk you through this. Hopefully it's easy to understand and make sense when we finish. So with migrant ed, there are a lot of eligibility factors that we have to go through as recruiters to determine if a family is eligible. And so we're going to start with some of the general things. So first of all, we have to find out if there is a migratory agricultural worker. So like it says here, this is a key eligibility factor. An migratory agricultural worker is a worker that made a qualifying move within the last 36 months, and within 60 days of that move, he or she was able to get a new job in agriculture, and the work had to be performed for wages or personal subsistence. So they have to basically move and then, in the last 36 months and get a job in agriculture within 60 days of that move. So that's one of the very first key eligibility factors. Migratory child is a child who is under the age of 22, still eligible for free public education through grade 12, and is not yet at that grade level at which the local education agency provides free public education. So they haven't yet graduated. Also, the child must have made a move, qualifying move, in the preceding 36 months. They need to themselves been a migratory agricultural worker, or they needed to join one that's a parent, guardian, or spouse who is a migratory agricultural worker or a migratory fisher. And they also have to have moved from one residence to another and from one school district to another due to economic necessity. So you can kind of review that and think that through. I'll kind of continue on, but all of these resources you can review at any point to really make sure that it soaks in and makes sense. The other things that we always look at is, what is a qualifying move? Qualifying move is a move that is made due to economic necessity from one residence to another and from one school district to another. So the kids have to be changing. They can't just stay in the same district. They have to move, change residence from one school district to another. And that move has to be due to economic necessities. We'll talk about in a little bit. So once they do get a job in agriculture, we talked about that migratory agricultural worker, the job cannot last more than 12 months. The work has to be seasonal or temporary. And again, it cannot last longer than those 12 months. Make sure that I am recording. So other things, does the child need to move with the migratory agricultural worker? Remember, they must join the migratory agriculture worker within 12 months of when they moved. Either maybe they move first and then the worker comes after that. Anytime that movement has to be within 12 months of each other. So we have something called the qualifying arrival date, or the QAD. Qualifying arrival date is the date that the child and that worker complete a qualifying move together. So when I say together, that means that, the dad could have came and worked in agriculture, and then the child is coming a month later once school starts. That qualifying arrival date would be when that happened, when they're both together. Another thing we talk about a lot is a residency date. A residency date is the date when the child arrives in your school district where they currently reside. What is a subsequent move? A move, there are different moves. There may be a qualifying move that they specifically move for agriculture. There could be another move after that they move for other purposes due to economic necessity, that they make a move with a migratory agriculture worker. And we'll talk about that later in a little bit more detail. A few other key eligibility factors. What is qualifying work? Qualifying work is in agriculture, such as in the production or processing of raw agricultural products, such as crops, poultry, or livestock. It can also be dairy work, as well as the cultivation or harvesting of trees that is performed for wages or personal subsistence. So you see, it's pretty broad. You've got everything from processing raw agricultural products, you've got crops, you've got things grown in the field, poultry, livestock, dairy, all of those can be qualifying work. Livestock can be any animal kept primarily for breeding or slaughter purposes, which includes beef, hogs, sheep, goats, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit later on also about initial processing. So this agriculture work that they do has to be working with the raw product. So it can't be anything, I like to say, once it's the apples, not the apple pie. So it's that beginning part. It's the chicken, it's not the chicken pot pie. It's the very beginning part of that agricultural product. We talked a little bit about this already, about economic necessity. Economic necessity, it means the child and the worker move basically because they could not afford to stay in the current location, or they're moving for better economic opportunities. So it's very much related to to economics and kind of the basic necessities of life. Make sure that I change my slide. So moving now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the migratory agricultural worker themselves, and so go a little bit deeper into that. So a migratory agricultural worker is a worker that made a qualifying move within the last 36 months, like we just mentioned, and right away within 60 days, he or she engaged in that new work that was eligible. So again, it has to be the initial processing, it has to be a job that's working with the raw product, and it has to be a job that's performed for wages or personal subsistence. Also, migratory fishers are eligible too. Same thing as a migratory agricultural worker, but they have to be moving specifically to engage in that type of activity. And they have to seek it. It says individuals who did not engage in such new employment soon after a qualifying move may still be considered a migratory fisher, same thing as a migratory agricultural worker, if he or she meets both of the following criteria. So this is new. So let's say you meet a worker and he tried to get a job as a fisher, but he wasn't able to obtain it. You can look back and see if they have a recent history of moves for doing the same type of thing and see if that exists. So when we talk about soon after, that they have to get a job within, soon after the move, that's within 60 days. So our program guidance talks about that generally that's, 60 days that they're trying to get within. States can make their own policy if they start to see trends that they want to back up and see that maybe it's a little bit longer than that, but there would have to be a policy in place for you to be able to do that. So if the worker moved to get that fishing job and didn't get that job, and they didn't get it soon after, you can still look to see if they meet other criteria. So do they have a recent history of doing those types of moves? So it says here, if it takes a while, over 60 days to get the job, would they still be considered a migratory agricultural worker without that recent history of moves? They say no. They have to basically have either got the work within 60 days or have a recent history of those moves for qualifying work. So what is considered recent history? So basically, you're going to look back and see if they've made these qualifying moves. It says here, an individual's recent history of moves for qualifying work does not have to be from one school district to another, but it must meet the definition of a move. So they've had to have changed residence from one residence to another due to economic necessity, and it should have been to perform that type of agricultural work. They have to obtain that and have that recent history and engaged in that qualifying work soon after those moves. So if you have this person in front that says, hey, I came to work in fishing, but I couldn't get the job, but I did move several other times, and you're looking at their history, it says here they have to have at least 2 moves, and it needs to be within the last 36 months. So you can kind of look and see if that's the case. So just as a reminder, a migratory agricultural worker is a person who in the preceding 36 months made a qualifying move, and after doing so engaged in that new temporary seasonal work. Has to be seasonal, is affected by seasons. Temporary has to be less than 12 months, and it has to be working in that initial processing of the raw agricultural products. If they did not engage in that work, they need to make sure they need to have that recent history of moves to do that within the last 36 months. So now we're going to look at the children. So I know this is a lot to take in, but you want to think through it. A migratory child is a child who's not older than 21 years of age. We talked a little bit about this in the general eligibility factors. They're still eligible for free public education in your state. They have to have made a move themselves with a migratory agricultural worker if they're not the worker themselves. So that may be a mom, dad, spouse. They have to have moved with them. And the child has to move from one residence to another and from one school district to another due to that economic necessity. So not all kids are in traditional school. There may be what we call out-of-school youth. These are kids who are, all the way up to the age of 21, who are still eligible, could be eligible for free and public education in your state, but they've currently dropped out of school and they may be here working. So they don't have to be enrolled in school in order to be eligible for migrant ed. What about emancipated youth? So we know that emancipated youth are those who have not yet reached adult age, but who no longer are under control of their parents, who are solely responsible for their own welfare. Some of the out-of-school youth definitely would meet that definition. They are also eligible for migrant ed. Another question, what happens if a child lives with someone, a guardian that is a migratory agricultural worker? So to be, in migrant ed, we don't have to have, it says here that we just define a parent as a legal guardian or another person who's standing in place of the parent, such as a grandparent, step-parent, could be a brother or sister. So if they are moving with that guardian and that guardian is a migratory agricultural worker, then yes, that they also could possibly be eligible for the program if they meet the other criteria. So is it necessary to have some sort of document to establish this? No, not. They just have to basically be standing in the place of the parent and be responsible for the child's welfare. So another question would be, maybe you have a youth that's boyfriend or girlfriend is working specifically in agriculture, and this person is moving with them, and you say, well, is it absolutely essential that they have like a marriage certificate to show that relationship? That is not required. You can just go on, basically be able to sign them up if they're traveling with them and they are the person that is economically supporting them. So now looking at the types of work that's qualifying. So we talked a little bit about this already. Remember, it has to be production or initial processing of raw agricultural products such as crops, poultry, livestock, dairy work, as well as the cultivation and harvesting of trees. So that can be some timber work that is performed for wages or personal subsistence. So examples, we already talked about some of these, but just to make sure it makes sense, you're looking for those agricultural workers, the children who have parents or they themselves are agricultural workers that are working in those dairies, orchards, nurseries, greenhouses. They're either growing or harvesting plants. And it can also be, specialty crops, kind of like flower seeds, bulbs, vegetable seeds, sod farms, mushroom sellers, cranberry bogs, things like that. So different states have different types of eligible qualifying work. So also they could be under, it could be in a greenhouse. It could be planting, seeding, watering, fertilizing, staking, pruning, thinning, weeding, transplanting. You can see really there's lots and lots of different types of jobs in agriculture that can qualify. So sometimes it may be, here it mentions decorative greens or ferns that you're making for floral arrangements. The beginning part of that process, we talked about once it gets, that once you're actually making the wreaths, then it may not be eligible. That's the beginning part of that could be eligible. Livestock, those are meant all the things that most of us know, your beef, cattle, your hogs, your sheep, goats, things like that. It is things that are not raised for sport, recreation, research, service, or pets. So it says the term livestock does not include animals hunted or captured in the wild, but let's say someone is raising elk for meat or bison for meat, that possibly could be eligible if it was for breeding or slaughter purposes. So some examples of types of work that could be in this area would be, herding those animals, handling them, feeding, caring for them, branding, tagging, and assisting in the raising of the livestock. Talked about this already, but just as a quick reminder, you have initial processing. This is the beginning part of that, processing anything that's beyond that initial working with that initial raw product. You see here the cow, and then it starts getting cut up, and then you have different pieces of it. But once you start turning it into something else, then many times it's not eligible for us. So here's some examples of, stunning, splitting carcasses, hanging, cutting, weighing, sorting, enclosing the raw product in a container. These would all be part. Now, part that would not be considered part of production or initial processing could be maybe placing labels on a box, selling the product. Maybe you work at the farmer's market and you're selling it. If you're doing landscaping, maybe you're doing bookkeeping, maybe you're doing babysitting for workers, those kind of things would not qualify. Also, the workers that just come in only to clean the equipment afterwards, and that's all they do, that also would not be eligible. So it says here, when does that initial processing end? It begins when that raw product is turning into something that's more refined. So it gives here, such as placing raw chicken breasts in the oven for cooking, adding starter cultures to milk to make cheese, or applying necessary ingredients to a raw pork belly. You're starting to transform this into something else, and this is when it stops being eligible for us. Moving to a different area, cultivation of trees and harvesting of trees is also eligible. A lot of different things you could be doing with that: planting, seeding, staking, removing. Harvesting could be, gathering, and they're actually cutting the lumber. So this could be topping, felling, skidding. What would not be considered part of harvesting trees or cultivation of trees would be those that are trimming trees around electric power lines, cutting logs for firewood. This would no longer be eligible for us. You also cannot transporting the trees to a mill or something like that. That would not be eligible. So, but the processing of those, so maybe part of the lumber that they're cutting up in that initial processing, could be part of an eligible work. Moving on to fishing, fishing work, it's any sort of catching or initial processing of fish or shellfish. It could include raising, feeding, grading, collecting, and sorting fish, removing dead or dying fish from tanks, pens, or constructing nets and cages. So anything related to that fishing work. Also in the processing side, the scaling, cutting, freezing, dressing, and enclosing that raw product in a container. So remember, we talked a little bit about hauling lumber off of a location, maybe to a mill. Any hauling that's on, on farm. For example, maybe you take the watermelons from the field over to a shed where they're going to pack them. That could be qualifying, but it has to be on farm. It can't be transporting it to another farm or another location. Moving on to temporary work. So we're now looking specifically at, a specific type of work. Temporary work means that it has to last less than 12 months. It could be a few months, it could be a few weeks. So temporary work, any work that we has to either be temporary or seasonal in order for it to be eligible. Temporary must be less than 12 months. Seasonal means that it's directly dependent on the types of seasons in nature, cycles in nature. So 3 ways to determine if this, the work is temporary is one, the employer states that he's just going to hire the worker for less than 12 months. The worker statement, they say that they intend on not staying there longer than 12 months. Maybe they say, I'm planning on working in the dairy for 3 months and then I'm going to go work in the chilies instead. Or the state has determined by some sort of study or reasonable the basis that the employment will no longer last more than 12 months. Most recruiters wind up relying a lot on the worker statement because it is very rare to find employer statements. And then the state determination, you have to have a lot of data to back that up. So these are the 3 different ways that you want to make sure you have in your mind. So it says, here's an example of an employer statement. An example of a statement may be that employer stated that she will only hire the worker for the months of February through May to accommodate the increase of floral gifting. So maybe they're gathering the wreaths at, the things for the wreaths at a certain time. And or maybe they're, growing flowers at a certain time to get ready for, this particular florist. Now, I would say in this comment, just the floral industry could be busy, but we're not saying that work in a florist qualifies, but the growing of those plants and stuff could be the time that, that the employer needs more workers. An example of a statement from a worker could be the worker stated he plans to leave the job after 7 months in order to return home with his family. So he's right there telling you the reason why it won't be over 12 months. And then for the state determination, it says for employment that is constant and available year-round, if within 18 months after the effective date of this regulation, so this was from the guidance, they say that if they did some sort of document to be able to really show that none of the workers stayed there, that you could prove that, then you could have a state determination, but you would have to have the data to back that up. So what about if they do a bunch of different jobs that might equal out to 12 months? Would that still be considered temporary or seasonal? It says no, workers who are hired for work for more than 12 months by the same employer, same location, regardless of how many jobs they do, it could be considered a permanent job if they work over 12 months. So just remember, you're trying to make sure that temporary lasts, that you're finding workers that work in jobs that are less than 12 months, and you want to make sure that you have that thorough statement from the worker employer or through a state determination that you have. So now we're going to look at the moves and this idea of economic necessity and what that means. So qualifying move is made due to economic necessity from one residence to another and from one school district to another. So we do have a little asterisk that says, hey, if it's in a state that has really huge districts that has like one school district like Alaska, if they move over 20 miles, then that could qualify. But that's very rare for most states. That's more of an Alaska thing. What's a residence? Specifically in our regulations, it just says it's where one lives and not just visits. In some circumstances, it's boats, vehicles, tents, trailers, anything, but they're considering to be not just visiting, but actually living there. So the move, remember, has to be across school district lines. So we know the school districts have specific areas that are zoned for them. You have to move from one residence to another across school district lines. Economic necessity. So this means that the child and the worker cannot afford to stay in the current location, or because of a better economic opportunity, they're moving somewhere else. So it says the MEP is premised on the federal government's understanding that migratory children have unique needs in the view of their mobility and are generally low-income families. However, the statutory requirement that a qualifying move be made due to economic necessity clarifies that that's a really important part of the move. It has to be moved, and that has to be one of the main factors of why they're moving. What happens if you go on vacation? We just talked about economic necessity. A vacation would not be due to economic necessity. So anything that you're going to visit friends or family, even if you may work for a little bit on that trip, if it wasn't for economic necessity, if you wouldn't have gone on that, if the work wasn't available or something like that, then you really can't, that's not a move. It wouldn't be a qualifying move. So it says in these cases, the family is not moving because it cannot afford to stay or live in the current location or any other reason based on economic need. Therefore, even if the worker engages in the qualifying work, they did not meet the definition of a qualifying move. So you may say, well, what's the minimum duration of a move? So states really have to determine their policies on that. It says the statute and regulations are silent, but they must move to a place long enough to show that they moved. They're not just visiting, they actually change residence due to economic necessity. Is there a minimum distance? Remember, they have to at least cross school district boundaries, or in those, state that only had one district, they would have to go at least 20 miles. So what about if they have what we call day haul workers? They come in, they may travel to their work and then go back to their place. So they haven't actually moved. They're just going to drive back and forth for work each day. That does not qualify because there isn't a change of residence. They haven't moved. So now we're going to look at those qualifying arrival dates and this idea of, of children joining later on. It says, what is a qualifying arrival date? This is the date that migratory child and migratory agriculture worker complete the move together. So we call it the QAD for the purposes of the COE. So we just went through this of what a move was: economic necessity, one residence to another, from one school district to another. But it says, what happens if they didn't move at the same time? The child's move may either proceed or follow the worker's move, but it needs to happen within 12 months of when the worker moves. So in situations where the child and the worker do not move at the same time, the QAD is the date that they complete the move to be together. That is, if the child goes first and the worker joins later, the QAD is when they are both together, and vice versa. So when they both are together, that's when the QAD is. So remember, the child's move should generally occur within 12 months of the worker's move, and it's really hard after 1 year to say that their child's move was really even linked to the worker's move. So it needs to be within 12 months. So now we're going to talk about this idea of subsequent moves. In the past, we were always used to the move had to be specifically due to economic necessity, and they're making a move to go specifically in agriculture. Now we're looking specifically at a move. Remember, qualifying move is economic necessity from one school district to another, from one residence to another, and a child needs to be making that move with a migratory agricultural worker. So once you have these subsequent move, a subsequent move can be one of these qualifying moves. The difference is a subsequent move is a move with a migratory agriculture worker. So just imagine that you talk to someone and they say that they moved 12 months ago specifically to work at a dairy, and they only stayed there 3 months. So you can see that 12 months ago, they were established as a migratory agriculture worker. So for the next 36 months, the next 3 years from that date that they moved specifically to work at the dairy, that person can be considered a migratory agricultural worker. So if a child moves with them, even if it is another move, all of these meeting all the other qualifying things, and they don't get a job in agriculture after they've been established as a migratory agricultural worker, this can also be considered a subsequent move, and it can be a qualifying move. So examples of qualifying subsequent move: family moves from one place to another for cheaper housing. Now, we are making the assumptions here, and this would be the only way that they would be considered a qualifying subsequent move, is they are moving with an established migratory agricultural worker. So an out-of-school youth could be themselves a migratory agriculture worker. So they move from one place to another for work. Maybe they found out that the agriculture work job has ended, but they heard of another job in another place, and they have family close that can help take care of the kids, and now they're not going to work in a restaurant instead. That's perfectly fine as long as it is an established migratory agriculture worker within that 36 months. So they've made a move themselves for agriculture, and the children are joining that migratory agriculture worker. So they have to make that move together. So here would be examples of non-qualifying subsequent moves, because it goes back to some of the things we already talked about. Family moves to visit a family member or friends, or youth or family goes to attend a wedding or another event. They take vacation. Again, these are not economic necessity type things. It has to be, it has to meet all the qualifying move criteria in order for that subsequent move. So here's an example. Timoteo, Roxana, and their 3 school-age children moved from Managua, Nicaragua to Amarillo, Texas on November 10th, 2022. A month later, he starts working at dairy, so it's within 60 days. After working 10 months at the dairy on farm October 20th, 2022, the family moved to San Francisco, California because he didn't make enough money and he got a job with another company that offered him as a job as a welder. The recruiter found the family on January 5th, 2023 and signed the children up for MEP. So you could look, Timoteo was considered a migratory agriculture worker when they moved to Amarillo and he started working milking cows. So 3 years from that day, he would still be considered a migratory agriculture worker. That's when that would end. So they then moved to San Francisco. This would be a qualifying subsequent move. They moved due to economic necessity from one district to another, and the kids moved with a qualifying migratory agriculture worker. So remember, it's a move that occurs after another move, and it isn't always for agriculture, but it always has to be with a migratory agriculture worker. So here's one that you could think about, well, what about this one? On August 1st, after dropping out of school, 18-year-old Ramon moved from Greenville, South Carolina to Prairieville, Louisiana to work at a local nursery replanting flowers. On December 5th, he starts to feel homesick and he decides to go back. So you think, okay, would he be eligible? Now he can be eligible on that move that he made to the nursery, but you're trying to figure out if there's a new QAD or new qualifying arrival date in December because he's made another move. But it says here in this scenario, Raul's move to South Carolina does not meet the definition of a qualifying move, but he can still qualify under the previous move to Prairieville, Louisiana, but not under the subsequent move. So this move that he made back home was due because he was homesick. It wasn't due to economic necessity. So that wouldn't be a new qualifying subsequent move, but you could qualify him on that original move that he made to Louisiana. So the very last section, once we figure out all of this eligibility, we're going to fill out a COE, whether it's electronic version or a paper version. The COE should tell a story of that migratory family. So you're going to conduct this interview directly with the family. You're going to get that information. You're going to put the information on the COE that really tells the story of the family of how they're eligible. So states often use the information from the COE to determine the number of, and the COE, I don't know if I said that, it's called the Certificate of Eligibility. So you use those forms to determine the number of migratory children who live in the state, and then you compile demographic information about the migratory children. States are required to complete a COE before they can provide services to a child, and it's a super important document for migrant ed. There are a few things we wanted to remind you. There is a full guidance that you can go and read and really see the COE and be able to view that and read all the instructions. We're just going to talk a little bit about some comments that you need to put on there just as reminders. So we want to make sure that we're filling out all of the form. Some of you are going to be filling it out on a tablet. Others of you are still using the paper COEs. So just a few things to remember. You have to fill out a separate COE for any child who has a different qualifying arrival date. So you can have 4 kids in the family. If they all came at different times, you have to have 4 different COEs. So a recruiter must not include any children who were born after the move. Remember, they have to move. So you could just put in a comments that there's a baby that was born after the move. You would also not put anyone who was over the age of being eligible still in your state for that free public education, and anyone that did not make the qualifying move. So maybe, the whole family moved and there was a brother that was always living there. Well, they have to have moved in order to be able to be on the COE, to be eligible for the migrant ed program. So here's some of the required data elements. You get family data, parents' name, their address, the city, state, child data. You can see the list right there. And then when you're getting the particular information, we have verification codes. Usually the 1007 is the parent's affidavit. That's their statement to you of what they said. But if you were able to verify any of their birth information through any of these other ways, you would put those codes on the COE. So in the family data section, the recruiter will record that contact information for the children, the name of the children's parents and guardian. The current address section, you want to make sure that you get the actual address. In case that there is, some way that if there is no actual address, maybe they live in the field out in the middle of somewhere, you're going to try to really give a clear description in the comments of where that's at. You really need to want to get as close as possible to that address. Child data, you would have the name, sex, birth, date of each child, and you should include all children with the same family and eligibility data on the same COE. Anyone that has different information would be different eligibility information would be on a different COE. So then there's the qualifying move section, and this section is going to clearly define and show this migratory agriculture worker when they were established, when they moved specifically for agriculture, and then any information if a child went before or after the worker. So you want to make sure that you're really clear on this and you check that out. And then there are specific areas that are highlighted in yellow that you need comments. So for to join Moon, you have to put a comment. If they were, they engaged, if it took longer than 60 days to get the work, and you have a state policy that allows that, then you put a comment there. If they actively sought new qualifying work and have a recent history of moves, and you needed to put that on there, then you need a comment. Qualifying work, if it was first personal subsistence, you need to put a comment. If you're going on temporary work and you need to have the worker statement or the employer statement, of course, you would need a comment for that too. So you want to just make sure you're really aware of those. So a few other reasons why you would provide comments. Maybe this COE just needs more information so that a reviewer, it makes sense to them. Maybe the work is unusual that the reviewer might think, well, what is this? And you need an explanation to explain how. Maybe it's a series of activities that could be considered full-time work, but you're showing how this is still temporary. Or maybe the reviewer would think that the work was temporary or year-round, and you're explaining how this specifically is temporary. Maybe the parent can't, or the person can't sign, and they put an X. So you would explain that in a comment that that the worker couldn't sign, and they just put the X. Maybe the information was provided by someone who is not the worker, and you're saying this was provided by Juan's brother, Ramon, who gave me this information. Or maybe the mailing address is different from the physical residence, or the legal parent guardian is different from the current parent guardian. And then you want to make sure that you get the signature there, and you get that signature for the day that it's conducted. So this is a whole bunch of just beginning things to think about. So I would encourage you to use this section of the website that this training is housed on, so that you can really go back and study the areas that you need more help on. We do have some quizzes that you can take and get automatic feedback on the questions. And we hope this gives you a really good beginning eligibility understanding of the basic eligibility requirements of migrant ed.